Hello everyone and welcome to an Assetto Corsa video. I don't normally do these very often, but here we are doing one. And answering a question that a lot of people do ask me. I see it in the comments all the time. While we're streaming, people say, what do you do to the car? And I do tell them the answer, but you're going to have it in a video form as well. So just give you a bit of a brief if you're new to the channel or not sure who I am, etc. I hate setting up cars. It's one of my deep hates in terms of racing games. I just like to jump in and go. Now, Assetto Corsa, generally speaking, is quite good with that. The aggressive setup is pretty much there or thereabouts. You just get into it and, get a decent race out of a race or, racing your competitors. However, I wanted to get better, so I joined RCI's GT3 League. I was putting in quite a significant amount of time originally, 3 to 4 hours on the setup. So initially, it was even longer than that. And then I got it down to about an hour or two just to, fine-tune my knowledge. And that's the point of this video. I'm going to show you some of the tips that I do, some of the numbers I use that I consistently use across the board. And if you want to use these, you can try them out or potentially come up with your own idea. Now, huge shout out to Gregor Schill's video. I've shouted it out before. I will shout it out again. I use this as my base. This is how I started learning how to set up a car in Assetto Corsa. It is a superb video. If you don't want to watch mine, go check out that video. It is fantastic. Critically, you're probably going to go, Tidge, why don't you share your setups? I will explain that now. So you should always start with a base in terms of a setup, one that works. The aggressive setup works well. I was gifted the Coach Dave Academy setup, so I use that as my base. Therefore, some of the settings that I won't show are Coach Dave Academy settings. You can buy them. It's not in my place to share these settings out there. They use Motec, for example, for all the dampers stuff. That is not my knowledge or area of expertise. I will not be discussing that. Therefore, I will not show that either. And that's why I don't share my setups. Where I can share setup information, I do. As I say, people come on stream and ask me information. I give out this information I'm about to give you now. Let's jump to the setup area then in Assetto Corsa Competizione in the Bentley that you're seeing in the background at Imola. And let me discuss what I actually do in terms of car setup and how I go about it. And hopefully this will answer some of your questions. So, tyre pressures first of all. Tyre pressures, and you guys told me this when I first started playing Assetto Corsa Competizione, should be 27.7 all round. But I don't mean in here. What I mean is, after you've done 3 to 5 laps out on the circuit, your tyre pressures should show 27.7. Well, that's the golden ticket in terms of what I've been aiming for across the board in GT3. So let's just say, for example, they're showing 27.9 in the race or in your laps that you've just done. You've just done 5 laps. It's showing 27.9 on the left front tyre. I would come into the setup and I would drop that down to I'll drop it 0.2 psi. So that when I do another 5 laps, in theory, the whole idea is that your tyres should be down 0.2 of the PSI, and therefore you should be on 27.7. That's how I work the tyre pressures. I aim to get 27.7, first of all, across the board. Really nice and easy. The next thing I look at is tyre temperatures. Now, this isn't a very good example because I'm showing 000. I've not been out in the car. I'm just showing you this setup screen. Now, generally speaking, they want to be above 70 degrees. And the visual way you know that is your tyres will be purely green in terms of the telemetry as you're racing around the circuit. If they're not green, the first thing that I do is I go to the aero and I start adjusting the brake ducts here. Now, you'll notice this is on 1 for the rear. Not something I would advise too often in terms of brake ducts going down to 1. In this situation, it worked out okay. But when you go down to 1, usually you find that, well, I find at least that the brakes become a bit temperamental. But even so, as long as they're not consistently red or yellow in terms of the visuals, you should be fine there. And my brake balance is towards the front anyway, which is why this is at 2. So obviously the front brakes are getting used more than the rear brakes. Now, obviously, brake ducts do affect the tyre temperatures because the lower this number, the more closed they are. Therefore, they get less fresh air, which means they keep more of the heat. More heat is then transferred to the tyre. Of course, when you're doing your out lap, your warm-up lap, before the start of the race, generally speaking, you're riding that brake to get the tyre temps up by allowing the brakes to really heat up there and radiate that heat into the tyre so that you have the warmest tyres possible before you start the race. And you should be doing that as well. So brake ducts is where I would normally go. Let me just go back to tyres just for a second. I'm going to talk about camber just briefly. You'll notice that I'm down at minus 2.7, but let's just forget that for a second. Let's just load the aggressive setup just quickly here. You'll notice I'm minus 4. Now, if the outer edge of my tyre is really cold, this is where you'd start to lower this, okay? Because what it means is that rather than being pointed more inwards, the camber starts to reduce. So obviously there's more of the tyre in contact with the road. Therefore, the outer edges of the tyre will start to warm up. The difference across the inner, middle and outer, as far as I'm concerned, and what I've been running to, should be no more than 5 degrees. So the inner will normally be the hottest. The outer will normally be the coldest part. This difference should be no more than 5 degrees. If it is, I would recommend lowering that camber. Now, just to get back to my other setup here that I'm just going to load quickly, you'll notice I'm on minus 2.7 in terms of the camber. This is a magical number that I've found with the Bentley, okay? And I'm just going to talk about this just for a second. Now, I don't normally set camber straight off the bat. I would normally do it after, but I found this magical number, minus 3 to minus 2.7. Now, when I was learning how to do league racing and I wanted to get into it, I was obviously doing Kyle Army and Hungaroring, and I actually watched the replay for a driver who was going much quicker than me, and I compared braking distances into corners, and I realized that they were able to brake so much later than me. So I started figuring out what can I do to compensate this. If they're on a load cell, I can't compete with that with my T3PA pedals in terms of getting to 100% braking quicker. What I can do is potentially brake later, but have more of the tyre in contact with the road. This obviously generates friction. That allows me to brake later. That means the amount of friction there is increased because there's more tyre touching the tarmac. Therefore, I should be able to brake a lot better. More tyre in contact with the road, therefore friction. The brakes can grab, the tyre goes, oh, look at all this grip I've got here. I can brake in a straight line. But I reduced it to down to this point here. Between minus 3 and minus 2.7 is what I run in the Bentley. Now, if you go any further with this, so if you went down to minus 2.5, I start to feel a lot of understeer because obviously then the tyre is being impacted on the corners. So just keep that in mind. But I found this magical number. You might have your own magical number. Obviously, camber affects tyre temp. So if you do change camber, obviously if there's more tyre in contact with the road, there's more friction, as I've just discussed. Friction generates heat. Heat then goes into the tyre. So just be careful of that. If you have a cold outer edge of the tyre, reduce this camber anyway, to a point, of course. If you go too far, you'll just struggle with understeer. But even so, I have this magical number, and I run this nearly everywhere. Minus 2.7 on the Bentley. It's just my thing that my go-to in terms of camber. But let's just forget about that just for a second, because I know people, well, it's a nice tip for you, but I know most people will want to know exactly the order you should do it in. What I would actually do is look at Downforce. So we're at Imola here, okay? Now, Imola, you would expect probably to be a quite high rear wing, to be honest with you. I kept lowering it to a point that I was really comfortable with it, where if I reduced it anymore, I was getting a bit too much oversteer. You know, see I'm down at 7. The reason I do this is that I want to overtake people. Now, the best way to overtake somebody is just to flat out overtake them in a straight line, rather than trying to outbrake them and all that good stuff. So, rear wing down at 7 allows me to absolutely go for it. Now, in my history of playing Assetto Corsa, I've never touched a splitter, okay? So please don't touch the splitter, I guess, because nobody seems to. The higher this is, obviously, the more understeer you're going to get, because there's more air pushing down on that rear wing. It lifts the front up, more understeer. So if you are suffering from understeer, you may want to reduce this. It'll obviously make the rear a little bit more slippy as well. However, I get it down to a point where I'm happy that there's no oversteer on corners. I just lower the downforce as much as possible, so I'm less reliant on it. There's less dirty air. There are 2 exceptions that I've done for this, and that's Suzuka and Spa. Suzuka, the 130R, the Bentley just seems to struggle there anyway, irrespective of downforce, but downforce seemed to help it just a little bit there. And then also Spa as well, Eau Rouge Radion, just helps keep the rear planted as you go over that crest of the hill. Other than that, generally, I'm trying to lower that as much as possible. Try and get the speed up as much as I can on the straights to overtake people. And that's what I do in terms of the rear wing downforce. Now, ride height. This is the next thing I look at. And these do work in sync to some extent. So if you raise your rear wing and then raise your ride height, the rear wing becomes more effective. It's got more air hitting it, the higher it is. Therefore, it becomes more effective, but that will obviously mean you get more understeer. I try and lower my ride height, again, as low as possible without bottoming out the car. Reason being, the lower the ride height, obviously, the more streamlined the car is. It's not pointy. Therefore, less air resistance, you can go quicker. So, lowering the ride height, lowering the rear wing, it just benefits each other. You can really fly in this Bentley. And I must admit, when I was racing here at Imola in the RCI GT3 League, and when I race here just generally, I am very fast in a straight line, and people do struggle to overtake me. I know Tortellini did mention it in his stream when he was trying to overtake me, just the speed that I had. It's just there. You know, the lower that stuff, the faster you'll go in a straight line. You'll just struggle in some corners potentially, but that's more the high-speed corners. When there's high-speed corners, this goes up. Generally speaking, I try and lower it as much as possible. And that's what I do. Is it wrong? I don't know. I'm just telling you what works, and it worked well for me here at Imola. Now, let's go back to tyres again, okay? Toe. So you'll notice my left and right rear toe here is 0.07. I was at a circuit, I can't remember which one it was, and the toe was on 0. Now I was struggling with oversteer, and no matter what I did to the aero in terms of ride height and the rear wing, I'd either get it to a point where it would just understeer and I'd still have oversteer, or I would just oversteer. Toe was on 0. I upped this a little bit. In fact, I matched the Imola one here to 0.07. It stopped that oversteer. So do look at toe if you are still struggling with oversteer. It will stop it. Okay, I'm not a huge setup guru here, but I just know it just helps stop it. Okay, so please do look at that. It is very helpful in the grand scheme of it. This is the point where I would also adjust camber as well if you're struggling with oversteer, etc. I have lowered the camber on the rear as well a little bit here, but just in general, you know, camber and toe are the two things I would change. Camber is the main thing I would change. I would only change toe if I was really struggling with something. Like I was at one circuit. I want to say it was Kyalami. It was down at 0 on the base setup I was using. I put it to 0.07. It stopped it all. I was like, oh, thank goodness for that. I solved the problem. And then I could adjust the ride height and downforce accordingly. Now, what else have we got in here? Traction control and ABS. Now, I always been flicking between these two. I always used to think it had to be 2. But Joe McCauley actually was like, you know, just to avoid lockups a little bit, put it on 3. It seems to work out well. The Bentley's traction control specifically is very overpowering, so do be careful about that in the wet. That's why I try and keep it as low as possible. Even in the wet, I'd rather I control it rather than, I'd say the traction control just cuts all power, it feels like, in the Bentley in the rain. But you'll have to adjust that accordingly for yourself. ABS, as I say, that's just to stop locking up of tyres, any braking issues that I potentially might have. I just keep it on 3 there, so 3 is what I generally run in terms of that. Brake bias, should I say? I always run at 63%. I find if I lower it, the rear comes round too much. I don't know whether that's to do with aero, potentially, but I run at 63%. I find that's my perfect marker. You'll have to find your own. Obviously, the lower you go, potentially the better stopping power you have. So I talked about it earlier on where I adjusted camber. But when I adjusted the brake bias to try and solve that, because I didn't really talk about this earlier, what I found was I was just oversteering too much then in the corners because of trail braking, etc. So I found my perfect area was 63% in the Bentley. In other cars, that will obviously differ again. You need to find your comfortable area because you will brake very uniquely compared to everybody else. You might look like you're doing the same, but you'll be different to everybody else. You have your own way of braking. Potentially, you might trail brake a lot more. Therefore, if you have your lower brake bias towards the rear, basically if you do this, it goes more to the rear. This is more towards the front. If it's more towards the rear, you're going to start oversteering a little bit. So just be careful of that. And yeah, I just found it very comfortable on that 63%. I don't really adjust anything else in the suspension, if I'm honest. I did for Imola, and Imola is the only exception because I sort of realized I could do with a softer suspension because you really hit the curbs hard. You really hammer those curbs. And I felt I could gain a little bit more time out of it. So I played around with it a little bit. And I was like, excellent, I found my go-to thing. Because my base setups are normally Coach Dave Academy, as I discussed earlier on, I don't tend to mess around with this too much because I don't use Motec or anything like that. I try and keep it as simple as possible. I don't like going in depth with setups. But you might look at these numbers and go, 130,000. I've got so many notches to change. No, look, it's going up in increments of 5,000 here. It's not too bad. And generally, the rule of thumb that I got from Gregor Schill's video, again, adjust by 2 and just go out. So adjust both by 2. Go out, see what it does. Does it make it better? Does it make it worse? Have a good feeling from that. Try it again. But this all relates also to the dampers. I won't show you the dampers because that is the Coach Dave Academy part of this setup. And, you know, it's not my setup to give away. So, you know, I'm not going to venture down that route. However, I just as a suspension, a lot of this is custom for me and it's my own setup here. So you get to see this and you can use this if you really want to. That's all I do really in terms of setup, in terms of cars. I look at the tyres, I go, okay, I need the pressure sorting first. I then need to sort out tyre temps. Generally, I'm always setting this to that now. I don't really have to adjust camber in any way, shape or form. I know what I'm going to in the grand scheme of it. That works for me. I then look at aero and go, okay, ride height, rear wing, let's sort those out. And then if I have to adjust anything else, I'm just looking at the toe slightly to stop any oversteer. Because oversteer in Assetto Corsa costs you big amount of time. I'd say that is it. That is the summary of how I set up a car. Hopefully it's been of use for you. It's, you know, it's just what I do generally in terms of setting up a car. There's no secret tricks here, there, everywhere. That's what I do. And generally speaking, it gets me up to speed where I need to be. And you can use an aggressive setup or a Coach Dave Academy setup as a base. And just work from there, really. Anyway, I do hope you've enjoyed this video, if I can speak, of course. If you have done, please do give it a like. It helps me out massively. It costs you absolutely £0 and 0 pence. Subscribe if you want to stay in touch with all the content. But that is going to be it for me now, folks. Do have a fantastic day, week, weekend, wherever you are in the world. And I hope to see you in another video or live stream very soon.